The door of the gable mercantile closed with a sound like a breaking bone. It was a solid, final sound that shut out the past and locked the future. Ilara stood on the boardwalk, the wood rough against the soles of her bare feet. Thomas Gable, her husband's brother, had made a point of that. The boots had belonged to the store, he'd said, just like the dress, just like the food in her belly for the last 6 months. Everything had been an advance against a debt she never knew existed until the moment her husband, James, was lowered into the frozen ground. He had pressed $13 and a folded piece of paper into her palm. His fingers were soft and dry, unlike the calloused, warm hands of the man she had buried. "This clears the account," Thomas had said, his voice stripped of all sympathy. "The land is yours, as per James's foolish will, free and clear." He did not need to say what everyone in the town of Promise Creek knew. The plot was a worthless sliver of hillside west of town, a place of wind and rock where nothing grew. It was an inheritance of mockery. She looked down at the meager assets in her hand. $13, a deed to a place called the Clay Pit by the locals, a name spat out like a curse. She owned the clothes she stood in, a thin calico dress more suited for summer than the biting autumn wind that was beginning to claw at the edges of the town. Her worldly possessions could not fill a small sack. A few women from the church averted their eyes as they passed, their pity a sharper sting than the open contempt from the men who loafed outside the saloon. They saw a problem to be managed, a charity case in the making. A whisper followed her as she stood there, paralyzed by the sudden, brutal severance from her life. The Clay Pit Widow. It was a new name, freshly minted for her humiliation. They expected her to weep. They expected her to beg, to appeal to the pastor for a space in the church basement, or offer to scrub floors for a roof over her head. They expected her to break. But as the cold seeped up from the planks, a different feeling took root in Ilara's heart. It was not hope. It was something harder, something forged in the silent fury of injustice. She turned her back on the mercantile, on the averted eyes and the smug, settled faces of Promise Creek. She walked not to the pastor's house, but to the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The scent of coal smoke and hot iron was honest and real. She held out 10 of her $13. "I need a good shovel," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "And the strongest axe head you have. I'll find my own handle." The blacksmith, a man named Peters with arms like tree limbs, looked from the money to her bare feet, then to her face. He saw not a beggar, but a buyer. He took the money, went into the darkness of his shop, and returned with a spade whose edge was honed to a gleam, and an axe-head of dark, heavy steel. He said nothing, but his silence was a kind of respect the rest of the town had denied her. With her last $3, she bought a sack of flour, a packet of salt, and a small tin of yeast from a different store, one not owned by the Gables. Then, with the shovel over one shoulder and her small sack in the other, she walked west, away from the town that had already buried her. The journey was a punishment. The road dissolved into a rutted track, and the track into a faint trail marked only by the passage of deer. The rocks were sharp against her bare feet, each step a fresh lesson in pain. She learned to walk on the balls of her feet, to pick her way through the dry, thorny brush that grew in the thin soil. The sun was a weak coin in a gray sky, offering no warmth. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the heat from her skin and leaving her shivering in the thin dress. By the time she saw the plot of land, the sun was bleeding out behind the mountains. It was worse than she had imagined. The deed had described it as 10 acres, but it was a vertical landscape of rock and stunted, wind-twisted juniper. A bleak hill rose from the plain, its face a scar of pale, gravelly soil where nothing grew. It looked like a wound on the earth. This was her inheritance, a place defined by what it lacked: shelter, water, life. She slid down a gravelly slope into the heart of the property, her feet raw and bleeding. This was the place they called the clay pit. It was a shallow depression at the base of the hill, a basin of pale, cracked earth that looked like the bottom of a dry lake. The wind howled over the rim, scouring the basin clean. There was no comfort here. There was nothing. Despair, cold and heavy as a stone, settled in her gut. The town was right. Thomas Gable was right. This was a place to die. She curled into a shallow cleft in the rock, pulling her thin dress tight around her knees, and surrendered to the shivering that racked her body. For a moment, for one long, dark moment, she let the hopelessness wash over her. But as the last light failed, and the temperature began its sharp descent, she noticed something. Down in the pit, where she huddled against the base of the hill, the wind was gone. The howling she heard was high above her, ripping at the junipers on the ridge. Here, in the hollow, the air was still. It was a dead, profound stillness. She pressed her cheek against the wall of the hill behind her. It was dirt, not rock, and it was not cold. It was cool, but it held none of the biting frost of the air. It felt neutral. She dug her raw fingers into the earth. The top layer was dry and crumbly, but just an inch down, it was dense and damp, clinging to her skin like thick paste. It was clay, not the gritty, sandy soil of the plains, but a deep, pure vein of it. She remembered her father, a brickmaker in a life before this one, talking about the earth. He'd said that a good clay hill was a house that was waiting to be dug, not built. He'd said it held the memory of warmth, a flicker of something, not hope, but a grim spark of purpose ignited inside her. The town saw a worthless pit. Her father would have seen a quarry. He would have seen bricks. He would have seen an oven. Ilara looked at the south-facing hill, protected from the north wind. She felt the deep, insulating earth. She saw not a grave, but a foundation. The town was wrong. This place was not an ending. It was a beginning. The next day, she began to dig. The work was a brutal catechism of pain. She found a fallen juniper branch, its wood seasoned hard as iron by the wind, and painstakingly worked her axe head onto it, securing it with strips of her own dress. The handle was rough and unbalanced, but it bit into the earth. The shovel was her true partner. It was an extension of her arms, a tool of pure function. She did not dig a hole. She carved a room out of the hillside. The first few feet were a torment of rocky topsoil and tangled roots. Her hands, soft from a life indoors, blistered on the first day. By the second, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping patches of skin. She tore more strips from her dress to bind them, the rough fabric grinding dirt into the wounds. Every swing of the axe, every shovelful of earth, was a scream in her muscles. Her back felt as if it were on fire. At night, she would collapse in her shallow ditch, too exhausted to feel the cold, her body a single, throbbing ache. But slowly, methodically, the shape of a life began to emerge from the hill. She dug straight into the slope, creating a level floor about 12 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The walls were sheer, packed clay. The deeper she went, the richer the clay became, changing from a pale tan to a deep, rich ochre. This was the good earth, the earth that held its shape. She piled the excavated dirt and rock outside the entrance, forming a U-shaped embankment that would blunt the force of the wind and snow. Her first priority was a roof. She felled the stunted junipers on the ridge, her awkward axe swinging with more determination than skill. The wood was dense and twisted, but it was strong. Dragging the logs down the hill was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. She laid them across the top of her pit, side by side, leaving a small opening near the back wall. Then came the harder work. She hauled bucket after bucket of the thickest clay, mixing it with dry grass to act as a binder. She plastered this thick, heavy mortar over the logs, packing it down, smoothing it with her hands. She layered it a foot thick, then covered it with the sod and topsoil she had first excavated. When she was done, the roof was almost indistinguishable from the hillside itself. It was a living roof, one that would insulate and endure. Now she turned to the heart of her design, the reason she had dug into the back wall instead of leaving it flat. This was where her father's knowledge guided her hands. She began to hollow out a deeper, arched cavern in the center of the back wall. This was not a room, but a massive oven, its floor level with the floor of her home. She shaped it like a beehive, packing the clay until it was as smooth and hard as stone. From the top of this dome, she drove a narrow channel straight up, punching through the roof of her dwelling. This would be her chimney. She lined it with flat stones found at the base of the hill, mortaring them with more clay. The oven and the chimney were one. The heat that cooked her food would rise through a stone and clay core that was an integral part of her home's back wall. The thermal mass, her father had called it. The stone and clay would drink the heat from the fire, holding it long after the embers died, radiating it back into the small subterranean room. It was a furnace and a stove combined. Her water system was simple ingenuity. She noticed how dew collected and ran down a particular rock face above her dwelling. During a light rain, she watched the water trace the same path. She carved a shallow channel in the clay, leading from the base of that rock face to a deep pit she dug near her entrance. She spent a week lining this pit with layer after layer of the finest clay, smoothing it and letting the sun bake it until it was nearly as hard as ceramic. It was a crude cistern, but it worked. It held the water, clean and cool, filtered by the earth itself. After 3 weeks of relentless labor, the structure was complete. It was a cave, a den, a hole in the ground, but it was hers. She built a crude door from woven juniper branches and sealed the edges with clay. The first night she spent inside was a revelation. Outside, the wind howled its familiar, lonely song. But inside her earthen room, there was only a deep, profound silence. The earth itself seemed to be holding its breath around her. It was not warm, but the bitter, penetrating cold was gone. The earth was a blanket against the night. She knew she could not survive the winter on flour alone. She needed protein, and she needed companionship. A month after her exile, she walked back to Promise Creek. Her feet were no longer soft. They were calloused and tough, shod in a pair of rough moccasins she had fashioned from a deer hide left behind by a hunter. Her dress was tattered and stained with clay. Her arms were corded with new muscle. She walked directly into the Gable Mercantile. Thomas was behind the counter. He looked up, and for a moment, a flicker of shock crossed his face. He had expected her to be gone, or dead, or begging. He had not expected this hard, weathered woman who looked him directly in the eye. The few customers in the store fell silent, watching. "I'm not here for credit," Ilara said, her voice raspy from disuse. She placed $2 on the counter. "I want 6 chickens, and a young goat if you have one." Thomas laughed. It was a short, ugly sound. "Chickens? In the clay pit? What will they eat, rocks? Where will you keep them, in that hole with you?" The other men in the store chuckled along with him. The name had stuck. They called her the Cave Girl now, or Clay Pit Ilara. "Just sell me the animals," she said, her gaze unwavering. He took her money with a smirk, eager to be part of her folly. She bought a small bag of feed with her last dollar. Leading a bleeding goat on a rope and carrying a crate of squawking chickens, she walked back out of town. The laughter followed her, a wave of scorn at her back. but the mockery did not touch her. It was the sound of a world she no longer belonged to. Her world was the one she was building with her own 2 hands. Back at her homestead, she built a small, sunken pen for the animals against the side of her own dwelling, sharing a common wall. It too was roofed with earth and sod. It was protected and warm, and their body heat would add a small measure to the warmth of her own home. The goat, which she named Juniper, was clever and stubborn. The chickens were a constant, bustling source of life. One evening, as she was banking the fire in her new oven, a shadow fell across the entrance. A dog stood there, thin to the point of starvation, its ribs a rack beneath a coat of gray, matted fur. It was a stray, driven from the town to fend for itself. It looked at her with weary, intelligent eyes, not begging, but watching. Ilara broke off a piece of the flat, dense bread she had baked on a hot stone and tossed it. The dog ate it gently, then lay down near the entrance, as if it had decided this was now its home. She called him Ash for his color and for his appearance from the dust. He never left her side again. The town's mockery solidified into a local legend. Thomas Gable would tell the story to travelers passing through his store. "Got a woman out west of here, lives in a hole in the ground," he'd say, leaning on the counter. "Calls it a house. My own sister-in-law, bless her heart, lost her senses when my brother passed. Thinks she can survive a winter in a clay pit with a goat and a handful of chickens." The men would laugh and shake their heads. The Folly, they called her homestead. The Widow's Hole. The names were weapons, meant to isolate and diminish her. A hunter named Brant, who considered himself the toughest man in the territory, made a special trip out to see her dwelling. He stood on the ridge above, looking down at the barely visible roof, a thin plume of smoke curling from the stone chimney. Ash stood guard at the entrance, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ilara emerged, shovel in hand. "You'll die in there," Brant called down, his voice full of condescending certainty. "That hole will be your tomb when the snows come. A real house has walls of timber and a stone hearth, not mud and dirt." Ilara simply looked up at him, her face unreadable. She said nothing. She just went back to her work, turning over a small patch of earth near her cistern, where she intended to try growing hardy greens under a cover of oiled hide. Her silence unnerved him more than any argument. He rode off, shaking his head, convinced of her madness. As autumn deepened, turning the distant aspens to coins of gold, Ilara's life settled into a relentless, disciplined rhythm. Her world shrank to the size of her homestead, a universe of interconnected systems. Each day began before sunrise. She would rise from her bed, a raised platform covered in pine boughs and a single thin blanket, and check the animals. She would milk Juniper, her hands gentle and practiced. The milk was a miracle, rich and warm. She would collect the eggs, each one a perfect, precious treasure. Her primary task was fuel. The fire in her oven could never go out. She spent hours gathering wood, not the thick logs the townspeople prized, but the dead, dry branches of juniper and scrub oak. She learned the landscape, where to find the fallen wood that required no chopping, conserving the edge on her precious axe. She stacked the wood in a long, neat rick against the outside wall of her animal pen, where it would stay dry under a small overhang. The oven was the heart of her world. It was a living thing, a warm, breathing beast in the back of her home. Every 2 days she would bake bread. The process was a ritual, mixing the flour, salt, and yeast with water from her cistern, kneading the dough on a flat stone, feeling it come alive under her hands. She would build up the fire inside the oven's dome until the clay walls glowed faintly in the dark. Then she would scrape the coals and ash out and slide the loaves inside. The sealed heat, radiating from the tons of superheated earth and clay around it, baked the bread perfectly, with a thick, hard crust and a soft, airy crumb. The smell would fill her small home, a scent of life and civilization in the heart of the wilderness. The heat from the baking would last for 2 days. The massive clay and stone structure of the chimney and oven wall would slowly release its stored warmth, keeping the subterranean room at a constant, comfortable temperature. Even on the coldest nights, when frost silvered the ground outside, it was never truly cold inside her shelter. It was the quiet, steady warmth of a cellar, a constant 50 degrees that could be raised to comfort with just a small fire. She was tested. The first autumn storm was not snow, but a deluge of rain. A river of muddy water poured down the hillside, threatening to flood her home. She spent a frantic night in the driving rain, digging a diversion trench with her bare hands and the shovel, her muscles screaming, channeling the water around her dwelling and into the basin below. In the morning, soaked and exhausted, she saw that her cistern was overflowing with fresh water, and her home was bone dry. The system had held. She had learned. Another time, a pack of wolves, drawn by the scent of the goat, circled her homestead for 2 nights. Their howls were a thread of primal fear weaving through the darkness. Ash stood his ground at the sealed door, his barking a furious, desperate challenge. Ilara sat inside, an axe in her lap, listening to the scratching and sniffing at the edges of her door. But her construction was too solid. There was no purchase for them, no way in. Eventually, they moved on, leaving her in the ringing silence. She leaned against the warm clay wall, her heart pounding. She was alone, but she was not defenseless. She was the sovereign of her small, earthen kingdom. The first snows came in late November, a gentle dusting that outlined the stark beauty of the land. To the people in Promise Creek, it was a warning, a reminder to stack their firewood higher and check the chinking in their log cabins. They felt the familiar anxiety of the coming cold, the annual battle against the Wyoming winter. For Ilara, it was different. As the snow deepened, her world became quieter, more insulated. The thick blanket of white on her roof added another layer of protection, silencing the outside world. Her days were governed by the simple, powerful logic of survival. Tend the fire, feed the animals, fetch the water, prepare the food. The rhythms were hypnotic. The solitude was so complete it became a kind of presence, a silent companion. She was utterly alone, yet she felt no loneliness. Her life was full of purpose. In the evenings, by the light of a small tallow lamp, she would mend her dress with scavenged deer sinew, or simply sit and listen to the quiet sounds of her home, the soft bleating of the goat, the rustle of the chickens, the steady breathing of Ash, asleep by the warm oven wall. She had built not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. In the middle of January, the sky turned a strange, bruised purple to the north. The wind died completely, and an unnatural stillness fell over the land. Ilara felt it in her bones. The animals felt it too. The chickens huddled together silently, and Juniper became agitated, pulling at her rope. This was not a normal storm. This was something else. She brought the goat and the chickens inside her own living space, sealing the door to their pen. She packed snow into every tiny crack around her doorframe, making it airtight. She filled her largest pot with water and put on a stew of dried beans and salted meat. Then she built up the fire in the oven until the clay walls radiated a fierce, penetrating heat. The blizzard hit not like a storm, but like an explosion. It was a solid wall of wind and ice that slammed into the hillside. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single hour. The wind did not howl, it screamed, a high, thin, metallic shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. It was a blue norther, the kind of killer storm that old-timers spoke of with fear and reverence, a storm that could freeze a man solid in minutes. Inside her shelter, Elara felt the vibration of the wind through the earth. She heard its muffled, distant rage high above her, but inside, the air was still and warm. The fire in the oven was now just a bed of deep, glowing coals, but the massive thermal battery of the oven and chimney wall poured a steady, silent tide of warmth into the room. The animals were calm, reassured by the heat and her presence. The stew bubbled on a trivet over the coals, its savory steam a defiant scent of life against the storm's fury. She sat with Ash at her feet, her back against the warm wall, and listened to the end of the world raging just a few feet above her head. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. In Promise Creek, the world was ending. The conventional houses, built of logs and planks, were no match for the predatory cold. The wind drove the ice through the chinking like needles, encasing walls in a sheath of rime. Families huddled around their fireplaces, burning through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate. The logs, coated in ice, sputtered and smoked, giving little heat. The cold was a physical presence, a thief that stole breath and leached warmth from bone and marrow. Roofs, groaning under the weight of accumulated ice, began to fail. The meeting hall's main beam cracked with a sound like a gunshot, sending people fleeing into the storm. Livestock, left in hastily built barns, froze where they stood. The town's confidence, its belief in the rightness of its own construction, shattered in the face of the storm's absolute power. Mr. Gable's Mercantile, the proudest building in town, had its large front windows blown in, and the merciless wind gutted the store of its goods and its warmth, turning it into a frozen cavern. The people of Promise Creek were trapped, freezing in the very homes they had believed would protect them. They were colder, more vulnerable, and more afraid than they had ever been in their lives. For 3 days, the storm raged without pause. On the 4th day, the wind slackened, but the cold remained, a deep, abiding frost that held the world in its grip. The temperature was 20 below zero, and the town had run out of firewood. Desperation began to curdle into panic. It was Thomas Gable's wife, Mary, who first saw it. Her youngest son was sick with a fever, his breathing shallow and ragged. They had burned the last of their chairs to keep him warm, but the cold in their house was winning. Huddled by a frosted window, she saw a thin, almost invisible wisp rising from the hillside to the west. It was not the dark, heavy smoke of a struggling fire. It was the pale, clean heat shimmer of a fire burning hot and efficiently. And carried on the still, frozen air, faint but unmistakable, was a smell. It was the smell of baking bread. The scent was an impossibility, an act of madness in a world frozen solid. It was a sign of a warmth so profound, so impossible, that it could not be ignored. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Someone is alive out there. Someone has a fire." Thomas, his face gray with cold and fear, bundled himself in every layer he owned. He would not have gone for himself, but for his son, he would face anything. He stumbled out into the frozen landscape, following the ghost of that scent. The journey was a nightmare. The snow was crusted with a thick layer of ice that shattered under his boots, and the cold was a blade in his lungs. More than once he fell, and it took all his will to rise again. He was not heading for a homestead. He was chasing a ghost, a hallucination born of cold and despair. He almost missed it. The dwelling was so completely a part of the landscape, buried under the snow, that he would have walked right past it. But then a dog, a gray wolf-like creature, appeared on the rise of a snow-covered mound, not barking, but simply watching him with an unnerving intelligence. And from a small, stone-lined hole nearby, that impossible, soul-warming scent of bread billowed out. He stumbled toward it, falling to his knees before a low, solid door set deep into the earth. He pounded on it with his frozen fists, his pleas lost in chattering teeth. The door opened. Ilara stood there, framed by a soft, warm light. She wore a simple dress, her feet clad in hide moccasins. Behind her, the air was warm and smelled of yeast and wood smoke and life. She looked at the man who had cast her out, now a broken, freezing creature at her doorstep, and her face showed no triumph, no surprise. It was the calm, steady face of a woman who knew her own strength. "My boy," Thomas croaked, the words tearing at his throat. He's dying of cold. Mary, we have no fire." Ilara looked past him, toward the frozen stillness of Promise Creek. She saw not the man who had wronged her, but the child who was freezing because of his father's pride. For a moment she was silent. The memory of his laughter in the store, the sting of the nickname Cave Girl, the injustice of her exile, it was all there. She could have closed the door. She could have left them to the consequences of their own judgment. It would have been justice. But Ilara was not interested in justice. She was interested in life. She stepped back from the door. "Bring them here," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an unbreakable command. "And tell anyone else who is freezing, there is room." She gave him a smoldering log wrapped in damp hide to carry, a torch of impossible warmth to light his way back. Then she turned and went back inside, pulling a fresh loaf of bread from the glowing cavity of her oven. The rescue had begun. An hour later, they began to arrive. Thomas returned first, carrying his sick child, with Mary stumbling behind him. When they stepped from the brutal, killing cold into Ilara's home, the shock was physical. The warmth hit them like a solid thing, a wave of life that made their frozen faces ache and their eyes water. They stopped just inside the door, stunned into silence. They stared. This was not the filthy, damp hole they had imagined. The floor was hard-packed clay, swept clean. A soft light came from a tallow lamp. In one corner, a goat and several chickens rested peacefully, separated by a low wall. And against the back wall was the source of the impossible heat, a massive, arched oven, its mouth glowing with the deep red of perfect coals. The air was filled with the scent of baking bread and simmering stew. It was a place of order, of warmth, of abundance. It was more of a home than any of the cold, drafty cabins they had left behind. Mary Gable looked at the green shoots of herbs growing in a small box near the entrance, a patch of impossible summer in the dead of winter. She looked at the neat stacks of firewood, the shelves carved into the clay walls holding jars of preserved berries. She looked at Ilara, who was wrapping the sick child in a warm blanket, her movements calm and efficient. Mary began to weep, silent tears of shame and gratitude freezing on her cheeks. Others followed. The hunter, Brant, arrived half dead, his legendary toughness stripped away by the cold, leaving only a shivering, desperate man. He stared at the earthen walls he had mocked, the walls that now held the only warmth left in his world. He could not meet Ilara's eyes. By nightfall, a dozen people were crowded into her small shelter. They were the people who had scorned her, pitied her, and named her a fool. Now they were huddled in her warmth, eating her bread, their lives dependent on the very folly they had ridiculed. Thomas Gable watched her move through the small space, tending to the child, ladling stew into bowls, adding wood to the oven. She did it all with a quiet, powerful grace. There was no gloating in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." She was not performing an act of forgiveness. She was simply doing what was necessary. She was providing. He finally found his voice. It was a broken, humbled whisper. He walked to where she stood by the fire. "Ilara," he began, but his throat closed. He tried again. "We were wrong," he said. the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We called you a fool. My God." He looked around the warm, life-filled room. We were the fools. Elara looked at him, her expression calm. She broke off a piece of the fresh bread and handed it to him. "There is food," she said simply. "Eat." That was all. There was no absolution, no condemnation, just a simple, profound act of grace. In that moment, her victory was complete, not because she had conquered them, but because she had refused to become like them. Her strength was not in the cleverness of her shelter, but in the unyielding core of her character. When the Great Freeze broke a week later, the survivors emerged from Elara's shelter into a changed world. They returned to their damaged homes not with arrogance, but with a new and profound humility. The nickname Cave Girl was never spoken again. In its place, a new name emerged, spoken with reverence: the Woman of the Hill. The town of Promise Creek did not forget. The story of their survival became the town's founding legend. Thomas Gable, shamed and humbled, turned over the management of the mercantile to his wife, and spent the next year helping other families rebuild, this time with a respect for the lessons the earth had taught them. He never spoke to Elara with anything but the deepest deference. People began to make the journey to her homestead, not to mock, but to learn. They came with sacks of flour, with tools, with bolts of cloth, seeking not to give charity, but to trade for knowledge. Elara, in her quiet way, taught them. She showed them how to read the land, how to find the clay, how to build with the earth instead of just upon it. She showed them how to dig sunken pantries that kept food cool in summer and protected from frost in winter. She taught them the principle of thermal mass, of building ovens and hearths that stored heat. Slowly, the town of Promise Creek began to change. New homes were built lower to the ground, with thick earthen walls and deep, insulated foundations. The foolishness of the clay pit widow became the new wisdom of the territory. Her story traveled with trappers and traders, a tale of a woman who had been cast out with nothing and had built a life from the dirt. A woman whose quiet ingenuity had saved a town that had scorned her. Her homestead became a landmark, a testament to resilience, carved into the face of the land itself. Elara never moved back to the town. She stayed in her home in the hill, with her animals and her dog, Ash. Her life remained one of simple, powerful rhythms. But she was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of the community, its quiet, steady anchor. She had been stripped of everything: her home, her husband, her name, and left with a worthless piece of land. But on that barren hill, she had found something of far greater value. She had discovered that the truest shelter is not built from timber or stone, but from courage. And the greatest warmth comes not from a fire, but from a spirit that refuses to be extinguished. She had built more than a home. She had built a legacy, one that would be told for generations, a story of quiet strength, of the wisdom hidden in what others discard, and of the profound grace found in helping those who have wronged you.